The battles fought on the Western Front in early July, on the Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev and Bobruisk sectors, were marked by an overwhelming superiority of enemy motorized, panzer and air forces. Fatigued from continuous fighting, our troops were pulling back eastward, but even under these circumstances, they did their utmost to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy and hold up his progress for as long as possible. On the Berezina River, our troops put up especially stout resistance in the area of Borisov. The Borisov Tank School, commanded by Corps Commissar I.Z. Suzekov, fought in this battle. By that time, the 1st Moscow Motorized Rifle Division under Major General Y.G. Kreiser had moved into the area. The division was at wartime strength, well trained and equipped with some T-34 tanks. General Kreiser, who placed the Borisov Tank School under his command, succeeded in holding up the enemy's reinforced 18th Panzer Division for more than 2 days and nights. This was of great importance at the time. In this fighting, General Kreiser proved himself a magnificent commander. Meanwhile, German and Romanian troops launched an offensive from Romanian territory against the southern front, aiming their main strike in the direction of Mogilev Podolsky and Zhmarinka, and threatening to hit the flank and rear of the 12th, 26th and 6th Armies of the southwestern front. In the first 6 days of intense fighting, the enemy broke through the defences of the southern front and advanced some 60 kilometres. The position of the southwestern front deteriorated considerably, as the Germans, after several failed attempts, finally crushed the forces defending the area of Rovno, Dubno and Kremenets, sweeping through the gap. On July 4th, German troops approached the Novograd-Volynski fortified area, where their attacks were repelled with heavy losses. The enemy's motorized and panzer units were held up for nearly 3 days. Failing to achieve success, the enemy regrouped his forces south of Novograd-Volynski. On July 7th, they captured Berdichev, and on July 9th, Zhytomyr. The fall of Berdichev and Zhytomyr, along with the continued advance of Romanian and German troops toward Mogilev Podolsky, created the threat of encirclement for the 12th, 26th and 6th Armies of the southwestern front. These armies, fighting off the advancing enemy, were slowly retreating eastward. To eliminate the threat of encirclement, the command of the southwestern front launched a counterattack at Berdichev on July 9th, involving the 15th, 4th and 16th Mechanized Corps. Meanwhile, in the Zhytomyr area, the 5th Army continued its own counterattacks, while the southwestern front struck a powerful blow at the flank of the enemy's 1st Panzer Group from the Korostan fortified area. The fighting in the Berdichev-Zhytomyr area, which began on July 9th, continued until July 16th. Sustaining heavy losses and fearing a blow at the flank of its main group from the north, the command of Nazi Army Group South called off its offensive in the Zhytomyr area. This enabled the command of the southwestern front to withdraw the bulk of the 6th and 12th Armies, thus escaping encirclement and considerably reinforcing the defences of Kiev. Once again, the German forces were prevented from encircling troops of the southwestern front, forcing them into bloody frontal battles without pause. The panzers and motorized formations of von Kleist's group were unsuccessful in breaking through and gaining operational maneuver space. On the northern front, where offensive action had started on June 29th, the fighting was of a local nature and had no significant influence on the overall strategic situation. In the early phase of the war, our naval forces had no major engagements with the German Navy, and were mainly occupied with repelling air attacks. However, the Baltic Fleet found itself in a tight spot, especially at Tallinn, where all major warships and supplies were concentrated. The Tallinn base and the city were poorly defended due to the inadequate actions of the 8th Army of the Northwestern Front. All units of the Baltic Fleet, along with armed workers' detachments, were thrown into action to defend Estonia's capital. Hasty lines of defence and fortifications were set up at the approaches to Tallinn, and key objectives within the city were prepared for defence. The enemy's attempts to capture the city and naval base were thwarted by the heroic actions of the 10th Rifle Corps, units of Marines, Fleet Artillery, and detachments of the Tallinn Volunteer Home Guard. The battle for Tallinn and the Baltic Fleet's principal base lasted throughout July and almost all of August. By late August, due to the exhaustion of our forces and the reinforcement of enemy troops, the High Command decided to move the warships of the Baltic Fleet from Tallinn to Kronstadt and the Leningrad harbour, abandoning the city. The fleet's combat aviation played a critical role in the fighting for Tallinn, striking hard at attacking enemy formations. Tribute is due to the Baltic seamen, who fought as true heroes both ashore and on their ships. During this time, the Northern Fleet cooperated with the troops of the Northern Front, initiating submarine operations against German shipping transporting nickel ore out of Petsamo. The Black Sea Fleet primarily focused on transporting manpower and ammunition to coastal armies, actively obstructing enemy communication lines and shipments to Romanian and Bulgarian ports. A group of Black Sea ships, working with the Air Force, struck at the Romanian naval base at Constanta and systematically bombed Romanian oil fields and railroads. While I won't delve into specific naval actions, as the admirals and captains of the fleet are better suited to that, I must say that cooperation between coastal war fronts and the Navy could have yielded much better results if pre-war preparations for coastal defence and naval bases had been handled more effectively. Unfortunately, these issues were addressed too late by the Naval Command, the People's Commissar for Defence, and the General Staff. Almost 3 weeks had passed since Nazi Germany violated the Non-Aggression Pact and invaded our country. In this period, the German troops suffered the loss of around 100,000 men, over 1,000 aircraft, and nearly half the panzers committed to the attack. However, the Soviet armed forces, particularly troops of the Western Front, also sustained heavy losses, adversely affecting the subsequent course of events. The balance of power and weaponry on the Soviet-German front tipped even further in favour of the enemy. The Nazis advanced 500 to 600 kilometres into the country's interior, capturing economically crucial regions and strategic objectives. This came as a significant surprise to the Soviet people and our troops, but during these grim days, the Soviet people displayed remarkable moral and political unity. From the outset, the party concentrated its organizational and political activities on a single goal: rallying all forces to fight the enemy. Mobilization plans, especially those concerning ammunition production, were implemented on June 3rd. The People's Commissariats were instructed to increase the output of tanks, guns, planes, and other war tools. A week after the outbreak of war, the government cancelled the peacetime economic plan for the third quarter of 1941 and adopted a mobilization economic plan, which aimed to increase military equipment production by more than 25%. However, this proved insufficient, and a commission led by N.A. Voznesensky developed a more intensive plan for the last 3 months of 1941. The government adopted plans for the rapid development of the Volga region, Urals, Western Siberia, Kazakhstan and Central Asia in 1942, which played a critical role in putting the national economy on a wartime footing. The party adhered to Lenin's advice. Examples of this sort could be cited in great numbers. I think that this heroic period in the life of the Soviet people and the party has not been properly examined so far, just as the great economic effort made by the party and the people during the war. In such critical times and in the face of monumental events, the advantages of the socialist system and its enormous potential are seen most vividly. The heroic feat of evacuating and restarting industrial enterprises during the war, along with the party's colossal organizational work, meant as much for the country as the greatest battles of World War II. When the war broke out, the party immediately took a number of practical measures to tighten centralized administration of all fields of life, including the armed struggle against the enemy. The Central Committee apparatus was reshaped, and duties were distributed among the members to supervise vital sectors in military, economic, and political affairs. Our party already had experience turning the country into a single military camp, as mentioned in an earlier chapter. This experience was put to good use from the very beginning of the war, with adjustments to suit the new conditions. The Leninist principles of managing affairs in times of mortal danger were the foundation of all communist activities, both at the front and in the rear. The people fully trusted that the party would find a way out of the grave situation and organize the defeat of the Nazi forces. This took time. The setbacks and heavy losses at the start of the war complicated the struggle. The troops were pulling back inland, fighting all the way. The Central Committee, local party organizations, and the State Defense Committee ensured that the people understood the reasons for the temporary withdrawal. Despite the complexity of the situation, party organizations and local governments in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic republics successfully mobilized the people for active struggle against the enemy. To this end, mass underground party and Komsomol organizations were set up in temporarily occupied territory, forming the nucleus of partisan detachments. These detachments were joined by Red Army units that had broken out of encirclement. As soon as the Nazis stepped on Soviet soil, they felt not only the hatred of the Soviet people, but also the telling losses inflicted by those who had gone underground to continue the fight. At that time, the Soviet command had no choice but to assume the defensive along the entire strategic front. The country lacked the strength and means to launch large-scale offensive actions. It was necessary to activate large strategic reserves of troops, arm them properly, and eventually pass to an offensive to begin the eviction of enemy forces from the Soviet Union. All this was done, but later. Our forces moved to strategic defense while making forced withdrawals, often in disadvantageous tactical groups. Due to shortages in strength and materiel, we could not establish deeply echeloned defense systems, especially anti-tank defense. Our anti-aircraft artillery was also insufficient, and troops lacked adequate air cover. Early in the war, the enemy had near uncontested command of the air, which significantly undermined the resilience of our troops. Yet, despite some mistakes and insufficient resistance capacity, a strategic defense was organized and yielded good results. During the second and third stages of the war, when the Nazis tasted defeat on the Soviet front, they failed to build such a defense, which, along with other factors, led to their final defeat. The paramount objectives of our strategic defense were to hold up Nazi troops on the lines of defense as long as possible, to gain time and bring up troops from interior regions, build new reserves, and deploy them along the main sectors. To inflict maximum losses on the enemy, harry and exhaust him, and restore the balance of strength as far as possible. To carry out the party and government's plan of evacuating the population and industrial enterprises to the interior and adjust industry to the needs of the war. To muster maximum forces and mount a counteroffensive to frustrate Hitler's war plan, ultimately crushing Nazi Germany and its satellites. Our troops not only resisted the enemy on the ground, in the air and at sea, but they also dealt substantial counterblows wherever possible. The heroic Soviet troops and partisans inflicted enormous losses on the enemy. On the fifth day of the war, the Central Committee ordered the mobilization of Communists and Komsomol members into the army. They were not merely fighting men, but also political soldiers, becoming the mainstay of party organizations within the armed forces. There were over 563,000 Communists in the Red Army and Navy on the eve of the war, and more than a third of the army personnel were Komsomol members. Over 1,100,000 Communists went to the front lines in the first 6 months of the war. I frequently met with these political soldiers, who displayed unshakable confidence in our victory. They would often say, "We'll make it," and I could tell that these were not mere words, but a reflection of genuine Soviet patriotism. Their magnificent optimism inspired confidence in those who were beginning to lose their composure. On July 3rd, in a radio address on behalf of the Central Committee, Stalin explained the situation on the fronts and urged the Soviet people to readjust their lives and the economy to meet the needs of war against a powerful and treacherous enemy. Stalin called upon the party and the people to rise in a holy war against the enemy, to end unconcern and sharply raise vigilance. His speech was based on a directive from the party's Central Committee and the Council of People's Commissars, issued on June 29, 1941. This directive, in the form of an appeal, listed the major tasks of the Soviet people and their armed forces during the Great Patriotic War. Stalin's speech and the party's directive to the people were like a powerful alarm, echoing Lenin's famous call, "The socialist land is in danger." The call would not subside until the fascist intruders were wiped out. In times of crisis and hardship, a party entrusted with the destiny of a nation must know how to rally all strata of society, clearly define the goals, and name the enemy. Our Leninist party excelled at this. The party's slogan, "All for the front, all for victory," united Soviet citizens against the danger. The slogan rallied people of diverse backgrounds, men and women of all ages and origins. In the name of their patriotic mission to defend the country, the people of the entire multinational state rose as one, multiplying the material force and power of arms with their single-minded determination and unwavering faith. By decision of the party's Central Committee, political propaganda agencies in the army were restructured, and the post of military commissar was reintroduced in July to promote political work and enhance the party's influence in the armed forces. From the outset of the war, all mass organizations focused their activity on the general war effort. The All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions and the Komsomol's Central Committee worked out practical measures to assist the front, tighten labor discipline, provide care for the wounded and the families of soldiers, train military reserves, and organize local air defense. Young men and women displayed feats of patriotism at the front and in the rear, always ready to sacrifice for their country. I spoke with several Komsomol members before they were sent behind enemy lines for intelligence and sabotage missions. Although I did not record their names, the encounters remain vivid in my memory. One such episode occurred in early July when the enemy had occupied Minsk and was advancing toward the Berezina River. A group of 4 Komsomol members, 2 girls and 2 boys, all fluent in German, was to be sent behind enemy lines in the Minsk area. If my memory serves me right, the girls had been students at the Institute of Foreign Languages. When I asked if they were scared, they smiled and replied, "Of course, a bit. But if we're not captured during the landing, everything will be fine." They were very young and good-looking, but they had answered their country's call, prepared for a dangerous and difficult task. The considerable losses in manpower and materiel required several organizational measures to strengthen troop control and combat efficiency. Temporarily, the corps system of command was abolished, and the personnel and communications facilities were used to reinforce the army and divisional echelons. It was decided to reduce the number of divisions per army from 12 to 6, with the division becoming the largest tactical formation. Additionally, the number of aircraft in air regiments and divisions was halved, and the activation of high command reserves began on a large scale. The State Defense Committee and the Central Committee of the party instructed the High Command and the Red Army's political administration to tighten discipline among the troops. The Chief of the Political Administration and the People's Commissar for Defense issued a series of orders to this effect. In July, the situation on all sectors became even more complicated. Despite the engagement of a large number of formations brought up from interior military districts, we did not succeed in establishing a stable front of resistance. Though sustaining heavy losses, the enemy still maintained a 3- or 4-fold superiority in the decisive sectors, not to mention his superiority in tanks. For various reasons, the railway transport of troops was irregular. Newly arrived units were often sent into action before they were fully concentrated, which adversely affected the morale and tenacity of the troops in combat. Another weakness was that, due to the absence of high-speed cross-country vehicles, the troops were unable to maneuver the artillery on a wide enough scale to provide support in repelling enemy tank attacks at the right time. The fronts and armies had very few tank units and formations left. These were the conditions in which a bitter battle unfolded for Smolensk. The Smolensk sector of the front was defended from the northwest by the 22nd Army under Lieutenant General F.A. Yershakov, and just behind its left flank by the 19th Army under Lieutenant General I.S. Konev. The sector from Vitebsk to Orsha was manned by the 20th Army under Lieutenant General P.A. Kurochkin, while the 13th Army under Lieutenant General F.N. Remezov was lined up to the south along the left bank of the Dnieper up to the town of Rogachev. The 16th Army under Lieutenant General M.F. Lukin was deployed in the Smolensk area as the Western Front Reserve, while the 21st Army under Lieutenant General V.F. Gerasimenko and later Colonel General F.I. Kuznetsov operated on the southern wing of the front. The enemy aimed to cut the Western Front in two by committing powerful shock forces to encircle the main Soviet forces at Smolensk and thereby open the road to Moscow. A furious battle ensued beside the walls of the ancient Russian city of Smolensk, which had once risen as a near-impregnable obstacle to Napoleon's armies heading for Moscow. The 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups of Army Group Centre initiated the offensive against the Western Front in the first echelon. The 2nd Panzer Group struck its main blow from the area of Shklov, bypassing Smolensk to the southwest, with its 24th Motorized Corps advancing from Bykov in the direction of Krychev and Yelnya. The 3rd Panzer Group, in cooperation with the 5th and 6th Army Corps, delivered a flanking strike northwest of Smolensk. The Nazis had considerable superiority in strength. At the beginning of the battle, the enemy made deep breaches in the areas of Polotsk and Vitebsk, as well as to the north and south of Mogilev. The right wing of the Western Front retreated to Nevel. 4 infantry divisions, a panzer division, the Great Germany Regiment and other German units were advancing on Mogilev. The 13th Army formations that had been stoutly defending the city were encircled. The 61st Corps under General F.A. Bakunin manned the perimeter defences around the city. A brilliant showing in the battle for Mogilev was made by the 172nd Rifle Division under Lieutenant General M.T. Romanov. Around 45,000 Mogilev citizens were helping to build fortifications. The city's defenders repelled enemy attacks for 2 weeks. In cooperation with the right flank divisions of the 21st Army, counter-attacking towards Mogilev from the south, they pinned down part of the 46th and 24th Motorized Corps of the 2nd Panzer Group, inflicting considerable losses. While the enemy advanced east of the Dnieper, units of the 21st Army, under General F.I. Kuznetsov, forced the river on July 13th, liberated Rogachev and Zlobin, and moved northwest, fighting their way to Bobruisk. The 63rd Rifle Corps under General L.G. Petrovsky led the main effort. A few days later, Petrovsky died a heroic death. I had known him well. He was a talented and well-educated commander, and I believe that had he survived, he would have become an outstanding military leader. The counterblow dealt by the 21st Army contained 8 German divisions, which was extremely important. The staunch defence by the 13th Army in the Mogilev area and the offensive of the 21st Army at Bobruisk significantly slowed the enemy's advance in the Roslevel direction. Army Group Centre had to transfer several divisions from other sectors to counter the 21st Army. Stubborn fighting against a large enemy force continued at the centre of the front, with units of the 20th Army continuously attacking the enemy and holding the defences along a wide frontage. Still, they were unable to halt the advance of the German 9th Army, which outflanked our forces and pushed into southern Smolensk. On July 16, 1941, nearly all of Smolensk fell into German hands. The 16th and 20th Armies were encircled in the northern part of the city, but they did not surrender, continuing to fight for nearly 10 more days, delaying the German advance towards Moscow. The State Defense Committee, and especially Stalin, took that defeat hard. Stalin was furious, and we ranking officers felt the full weight of it. Meanwhile, the battles around Smolensk continued unabated, even intensifying. The High Command immediately organised a new line of defence, deploying it in the rear of the Western Front. On July 14th, while the battles still raged near Smolensk, a new front of reserve armies was established, consisting of the 29th, 30th, 24th, 28th, 31st and 32nd Armies under Lieutenant General I.A. Bogdanov. Most of these troops were later transferred to the Western Front. The armies of the new front were deployed along the Staraya Russa Ostashkov Bely Yelnya Bryansk line. It was also decided to form a new front to man the Mozhaisk defensive line, covering the distant approaches to Moscow. This new front included the 32nd, 33rd and 34th Armies that were being formed at the time. To address the critical situation during the Smolensk battle, the High Command decided to place 20 infantry divisions of the Reserve Front under Marshal Timoshenko, commander of the Western Front. These divisions formed 5 army groups under Major General K.K. Rokossovsky, Major General V.A. Khomenko, Lieutenant General S.A. Kalinin, Lieutenant General V.Ya. Kachalov, and Lieutenant General II. Maslenikov. Under orders from the High Command, Marshal Timoshenko directed these groups to launch counterattacks from the Belyartsevo-Roslavl area towards Smolensk to destroy the enemy forces that had broken through and join the encircled forces of the front, still fighting staunchly in the Smolensk area. My Kalinin, who had been listening attentively, remarked, "I rather think he's right." Stalin unhurriedly lit up his pipe, then eyed the other members of the Politburo and said, "Suppose we agree with Zhukov." "You're right, Comrade Stalin," several of those present said. "Timoshenko may rectify things yet." We were given permission to leave. Timoshenko was ordered to return to his front immediately. Plainly, the accusations had seriously offended Timoshenko. But then, all sorts of things happen in war. There isn't always a chance to consider people's feelings as major, intricate problems are dealt with. Following the truly arduous battles in the Smolensk area, the fighting on the western sector had, for the time being, died down. Both sides were restoring order in their troops and preparing for future developments. Only in the Yelnya area did the fighting continue. The Yelnya salient, captured by the Germans, was a highly advantageous bridgehead for an assault on Moscow. The Nazis were trying to hang on to it at any price. The enemy was continuing his offensive on the Leningrad sector, but despite some successes, he failed to break through the Soviet defences on the march and reach the near approaches to Leningrad. During the Battle of Smolensk, the Nazi Army Group North made an attempt to approach Leningrad via Luga. The German 41st Motorized Corps made its way to Luga along the Leningrad Highway on July 12th, but was halted. Then it found a weak link in the defence around the Kingisepp-Ivanovskoye sector. The 4th Panzer Group was quickly brought in from the area of Luga and broke through our defences. True, it was stopped by reinforcements that arrived in time. Another group of enemy forces, which tried to advance towards Novgorod and further on to Chudovo, met with stubborn resistance and failed to achieve any success. The advancing German Motorized Corps was attacked by elements of our 11th Army in the area of Soltsi. The counterblow of the 11th Army was well organised and had good air support. Caught unawares, the enemy turned tail and began a hasty withdrawal. In hot pursuit, the 11th Army inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. Were it not for the German 16th Army that had rushed over to aid von Manstein's 56th Mechanised Corps, it would have been totally wiped out. With the approach of fresh enemy forces, the 11th and 27th Armies of the Northwestern Front were forced to withdraw to the Staraya Russa-Kolm defence line. Meeting stiff resistance in the Luga fortified zone, in the DNO area, the Staraya Russa-Kolm line of defence, and in the area of Kingisepp-Siversky, Army Group North, comprising 2 armies and a panzer group, sustained considerable losses and could not continue its offensive on Leningrad without reinforcements. The outcome of the Battle of Smolensk, the mounting activity and resistance of the Soviet troops of the northern and northwestern fronts, and of the Baltic Fleet and the Air Force, caused a sizable breach in Plan Barbarossa. But what was going on at the time in the Ukraine, where the troops of the southwestern sector were waging bitter defensive battles? Capture of the Ukraine was of particular importance for the Germans. They wanted to overrun the Ukraine as quickly as possible and deprive the Soviet Union of a major industrial and agricultural base, and at the same time boost their own economic potential with Krivoy Rog iron ore, Donetsk coal, Nikopol manganese, and Ukrainian grain. Strategically, the seizure of the Ukraine would ensure support from the south for the central group of German forces, which was still charged with the paramount task of capturing Moscow. From the very first days of the war, the course of events in the Ukraine was running contrary to what had been envisaged by Hitler's plan of a blitzkrieg. Pulling back under the impact of the German assault, the Red Army was putting up a gallant resistance. Fighting stoutly, with skill and courage, were the 5th Army under General M.I. Potapov, the 26th Army under General F.Y. Kostenko, and the 6th Army under General Muzichenko. It gives me special pleasure to mention these outstanding army commanders because they had served as regimental commanders in the 4th Don Cossack Division of the legendary 1st Mounted Army. Meeting stiff resistance in the Kiev fortified area, the German troops executed a sharp southward maneuver so as to envelop our 6th and 12th Armies, which were withdrawing from the Berdichev-Starokonstantinov-Proskurov line. A part of the enemy force reached the sector of the 26th Army south of Kiev, but this could have no substantial significance because the main enemy force, Army Group South, was moving in a southerly direction at the time. Our 6th and 12th Armies were in for a bitter clash with the enemy force that was seeking to envelop them. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the German 11th Army, having broken through the defences of the southern front, was striking out through Mogilev-Podolsky in order to outflank and envelop these 3 armies. The troops of the southwestern front, acting in cooperation with the southern front, mounted counterattacks to hold up the enemy advance. They inflicted sizable losses on the enemy but failed to stop him. The Germans carried out a partial regrouping and lashed out again at the withdrawing troops of the 6th and 12th Armies. This time the 2 armies found themselves in an even graver situation. Because of the distance and the ensuing complexity of controlling them, the Southwestern Front Command asked that these 2 armies be reassigned to the Southern Front, which was then under the command of General of the Army Thofor Tyulenev. Its request was granted. During this reallocation, a considerable part of the retreating units of these armies were surrounded. Lieutenant General Muzichenko, commander of the 6th Army, was badly wounded and taken prisoner. The same fate befell the commander of the 12th Army, General P.G. Ponedolin. A very grave situation developed at this time on the southern front. Its 9th Army was fighting in semi-encirclement, part of it moving back to the Ingulets River. The enemy advanced to the Dnieper, and his breakthrough to Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk and Odessa badly aggravated the situation of the Soviet troops on the entire southwestern sector. Yet the German troops had paid a high price for their victory here. They were badly mauled, fatigued, and had sustained heavy losses. Since the moment I had returned to Moscow from the southwestern front, I saw all the events I have described from the viewpoint of Chief of General Staff, because I took part in them in that particular capacity, sharing responsibility, the bitterness of our setbacks and the joy of our infrequent victories, with other members of the High Command. That is why, before going any further, I want to dwell specially on the activity of the Supreme Command's Stavka, often referred to mistakenly as the General Headquarters, and to describe as best I can its role and structure and its manner of controlling the armed forces during the war. For understandable reasons, I am not going to touch upon anything that may, if revealed, prejudice my country's defences. Apart from the special chapter that the reader will now come to, the activity of our top command and that of Supreme Commander-in-Chief J.V. Stalin in charting and carrying out operations and military campaigns will also be described in other parts of the book. A Stavka of the High Command was formed on June 23, 1941. Differing slightly from what we had envisaged in the Defence Commissariat's project, its composition was Defence Commissar S.K. Timoshenko, Chairman, Chief of General Staff G.K. Zhukov, J.V. Stalin, V.M. Molotov, K.Y. Voroshilov, S.M. Budeny, and N.G. Kuznetsov. It would have been far better if Stalin had been named Commander-in-Chief, as we had envisaged in the original project. After all, with things as they were, Timoshenko could take no basic decisions without Stalin approving them. As it was, we had 2 commanders-in-chief, Timoshenko de jure, as put down in the government decree, and Stalin de facto. This complicated troop control and caused inevitable delays in drawing up and issuing orders. We had also suggested having N.F. Vatutin, First Deputy Chief of General Staff, in the High Command Stavka. But Stalin objected. A group of advisers was formed to consult the High Command on various topics. But it played no more than a nominal role, because all the advisers soon received other appointments and were not replaced. The High Command GHQ was sited in Moscow all through the war. This had an important effect on morale. Owing to enemy air raids, its seat was moved from the Kremlin to a small detached house with reliable working premises and good communications in the vicinity of Kirovskaya Vorota at the beginning of July. And a month later, operators of the General Staff, which was an executive appendage of the High Command, moved their desks to the platform of the nearby Kirovskaya station of the Moscow Underground. On June 30th, 1941, the party's Politburo formed a special body, the State Defense Committee, with Stalin at its head, on the model of Lenin's Council of Worker-Peasant Defense, which functioned during the Civil War and the foreign armed intervention. It held all power in its hands and was the top organ in charge of defense. All civilian, party and government organizations were obliged to abide by all its resolutions and orders. To control their fulfillment, the committee had representatives in all the territories and regions, the war industry commissariats, the biggest enterprises and the building sites. At its sittings, which might be called at any time of the day or night, usually at the Kremlin or in Stalin's country house, the committee discussed and took decisions on all crucial issues. Military plans were examined by the party's Politburo and the State Defense Committee. People's commissars, who were to take part in supporting the operation, were invited. Whenever there was a chance, this practice enabled us to concentrate vast material resources at key points, carry through a coordinated policy of strategic guidance, and, with the organized rear helping out, dovetail troop actions with the countrywide war effort. Heated debates at committee meetings were frequent, the opinions firm and couched in precise language. If no consensus was reached, a commission would be formed at once, consisting of supporters of the opposite views who were instructed to report an agreed proposal at the next meeting. The State Defense Committee adopted some 10,000 resolutions and decisions of a military and economic nature during the war. All of them were carried out with precision and energy. They gave the start to assiduous work, assuring a single-party line in the country's administration during that rigorous and arduous time. On July 10, 1941, by decision of the State Defense Committee, the Stavka of the High Command was converted into the Stavka of the Supreme Command, and on August 8th into the Stavka of the Supreme High Command. From that moment on, and until the end of the war, Stalin was Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Once the State Defense Committee had been formed and the Supreme Command established, with one and the same person, the General Secretary of the party's Central Committee and Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, at their head, the structure of the country's wartime political and military administration was complete. The party's Central Committee coordinated the activity of all party, government, military and economic agencies. Now I was working directly with J.V. Stalin. I had never associated with him as closely before. Initially, I felt a little awkward in his presence. Besides, I knew I lacked experience in strategic matters and was never sure of the accuracy of my forecasts. In the early period of our association, Stalin did not have much to say to me. I felt that he was sizing me up most attentively and had no fixed opinion of me yet as Chief of General Staff. However, as experience accumulated, I became more confident and bold in expressing my ideas. I also noticed that Stalin began to give them more heed. On July 19, 1941, a decree of the USSR Supreme Soviet Presidium appointed Stalin the People's Commissar for Defense. I must say that with Stalin's appointment as Chairman of the State Defense Committee, Supreme Commander-in-Chief, and Commissar for Defense, all of us at the General Staff, the central divisions of the Defense Commissariat, the USSR State Planning Committee, and other governmental and economic bodies instantly felt his firm and sure hand. Every member of the State Defense Committee had a concrete assignment and was strictly responsible for the fulfillment of economic plans. One was responsible for the output of tanks, another for guns and shells, a third for the output of aircraft, and a fourth for logistics, food supplies, equipment, etc. Commanders of arms of the service were ordered by Stalin personally to back up the respective committee members and help them in seeing to the fulfillment of production programs according to schedule and of requisite quality. With the party's political work making the due impact, and with us generals improving our art of troop control through the accumulated combat experience, our resistance to the enemy grew stronger. All soldiers of the armed forces displayed heroism and dedication in battle. Military discipline tightened visibly. Still, despite the energetic efforts of the Supreme Command and the various front commands, the situation continued to deteriorate. Under pressure from superior enemy forces, our troops were rolling back to the country's interior. In the early months of the war, the most difficult situation prevailed in the western and northwestern sectors. The strategic defense put up by the Soviet armed forces took shape in a most unfavorable military situation, though it was most active and resolute. The party's Central Committee and the State Defense Committee were deeply concerned with the country's air defenses because Nazi aviation was highly active. Indeed, the enemy pinned great hopes on the Luftwaffe. The Nazis expected that by their massive air raids they would wreck the mobilization in the country's western regions, disorganize transport and administration in the immediate rear, and undermine the people's will to resist. Hitler showered privileges and rewards on his air pirates and their chief, Goering. Supreme Commander Stalin analyzed the situation and took special note of the deficient air defense of the country's main objectives. Thereupon, with his usual energy, he tackled the question of an anti-aircraft shield. He invited a group of ranking commanders to offer ideas on how to improve the structure and controls of the air defense machinery, and to do so within 2 days. General N.N. Voronov, Chief of Red Army Artillery, and Generals M.S. Gromardin, D.A. Zhuravlev, P.F. Zhigarev, N.D. Yakovlev, and others helped him greatly with their advice. The main task at the time was to put up an umbrella over Moscow, Leningrad, and other large industrial centers producing tanks, aircraft, guns and shells, and oil, as well as over leading railway junctions and power-producing and communication centers. The biggest anti-aircraft defense unit was formed to protect Moscow. Before the end of July, it already had 585 fighter planes, 964 anti-aircraft guns, 166 large-caliber anti-aircraft machine guns, approximately 1,000 searchlights, and a large number of barrage balloons. This structure paid off. The Nazi Air Force was unable to break through to Moscow en masse despite enormous losses. Many thousands of Nazi bombers took part in the raids, but only a few, not more than 2 or 3%, managed to reach the Soviet capital, and when they did, they were compelled to drop their deadly load at random. During the enemy air raids, the Supreme Commander often visited the underground premises of the capital's anti-aircraft command post and observed how the enemy aviation was driven off. The top man here was General D.A. Zhuravlev, who supervised air defenses with a cool head and efficiency. After the raid, Stalin would usually stay on and talk to the operators. He asked them what they thought the Supreme Command could still do to buttress air defenses, and first of all the air defences of Moscow. As the war progressed, the air defence machinery continued to improve and made a memorable contribution to the common cause of crushing the Nazi aggressors. I can still remember the personnel of the Leningrad and Baltic Fleet air defence units, and do so with deep respect and gratitude. They repulsed the massive, almost daily enemy raids heroically and with great skill. The Soviet strategic leadership took some time to coalesce, going through a succession of fundamental alterations prompted by the course of the war and the general situation. Gradually, however, Soviet military science, acting on past experience, made visible progress in troop control. Commanders, political officers, and the personnel of tactical and strategic staffs were essentially well selected from among young, energetic, and capable officers and generals. They were eager and enthusiastic, continually improving their knowledge of strategy and their operational art. The General Staff, Naval Headquarters, the Commissariat for Defence, front commanders, commanders of naval fleets and military districts, and the respective staffs did everything they could to make the armed forces more combat-ready to win a victory. The absence of a top military body, such as the Stavka of the Supreme Command at the time when Nazi Germany attacked, naturally affected troop control in the initial phase of the war and had a detrimental effect on the general strategic situation. This was compounded by the fact that in his earlier ventures in Europe, the enemy had already acquired considerable experience in organizing warfare and sudden invasions. Additionally, the commanders-in-chief of the directions and the front commanders were guilty of significant faults in troop control at the beginning of the war. This naturally led to negative results. I am often asked why we were not wholly prepared for the war when it broke out and why our troop control was so faulty. To begin with, I think it will be fair to say that many of the ranking operators of the Defense Commissariat and the General Staff relied too much on the experience of World War I. In theory, most of the commanders of the tactical and strategic echelon, including the General Staff leadership, were aware of the changes that had occurred since then in the nature and methods of warfare. But in practice, they had prepared themselves to fight along the old lines, mistakenly thinking that any big war would, as before, start with border clashes, and that the main enemy forces would not be committed until later. Contrary to expectations, the war began with a massive offensive by all of Nazi Germany's land and air forces. It should also be admitted that a certain share of the blame for the faults in the training of troops when war broke out fell to the Defense Commissar and his immediate subordinates. Nor can I, as former Chief of General Staff and the Defense Commissar's closest helper, absolve myself of blame for all these faults. Last but not least, a conspicuous role was played by the fact that right up to the last moment, up until the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, Stalin kept clinging to the hope that he would still manage to delay the outbreak of war. To a certain extent, this handcuffed the Defense Commissar, who did not summon enough courage to approach Stalin with the idea of forming a supreme command until the spring of 1941. At the end of spring, I again had to request the Commissar, this time in the most insistent terms, to tell Stalin that a plan to organize a Stavka of the High Command had been drafted by the General Staff and that he should consider it immediately, allowing the General Staff to test it in large-scale staff exercises. This time the Commissar apprised Stalin, and the latter permitted us to hold the exercise, but farther away from the border, somewhere along the Valdai-Orsha-Gomel-Sayal river line. Following that, we were to provide him with the blueprint of a high command, its functional purpose and executive bodies. Reconnaissance of terrain for the staff exercise was held in May 1941, but the exercise itself never occurred. Due to lack of time and other reasons, we took no steps to prepare the ground for a Stavka of the High Command and its executive bodies. In many other chapters of this book, I will refer to mistakes in troop control. This applies most of all to the first period of the war, up until the counteroffensive at Stalingrad. To be sure, this most difficult period for us did not consist solely of mistakes. We mounted large-scale operations quite successfully, wrecked the Nazi plan of capturing Leningrad, and crushed the enemy troops thrusting toward Moscow. These and other battles taught our commanders many useful lessons. Our army matured, and troop guidance improved. When the difficulties of the early period were surmounted, leadership of the armed struggle by the Supreme Command and the front commands became far more effective. At General Headquarters, we could see most clearly that in a war, mistakes differed. Some could be remedied, others were hard to correct. Everything depended on the nature of the mistakes and their magnitude. Tactical mistakes, experience showed, could be quickly remedied at a superior level of command. It was far more difficult to rectify miscalculations of an operational scale, especially if the command lacked the requisite manpower and weaponry or had missed the time to commit them where and when necessary. Extraordinary efforts were required on the scale of the country to rectify the strategic mistakes of the Supreme Command and the commands of some of the fronts in the summer of 1942, which allowed Nazi troops to reach Stalingrad and the Northern Caucasus. Looking back, I take the liberty to say that no political or military leadership of any other country could have survived such trials, or found a way out of the extremely unfavourable situation. Strategy, as we know, depends wholly on politics, and mistakes of a politico-military nature on the scale of a country are hard to remedy. Only a country that is fighting a just war and has the necessary war-industrial capacity can cope with them. Conversely, when the war aims are contrary to the vital interests of the people, mistakes of that kind lead, as a rule, to catastrophic consequences. But there are also irremediable errors. Take the error committed by the Nazi leadership when it risked attacking the Soviet Union. That error originated from overestimating Nazi Germany's own strength and capacity and underestimating the potential of the Soviet Union, a socialist country where the armed forces, the people, the party, and the government stood united. In the flush of previous easy victories, Hitler and his political and military aides were sure they would march victoriously across the Soviet Union as they had done in Western Europe. But that was their irremediable mistake. Guided by their adventurist and nationalist fascist ideology, the Nazis were incapable of drawing the right conclusions in matters crucial for the outcome of the war, and they should have approached these issues from a scientific angle, taking into account the social aspects when preparing for war. The Communist Party and the Soviet government studied the reasons for our unsuccessful operations in 1942. Then, relying on the indisputable advantages of the socialist social and political system, they marshalled the country's strength for a new effort to repulse the enemy. Thanks to the selfless and dedicated support of the people, the Soviet Supreme Command found the most acceptable methods and forms of struggle suited to the situation and, in the final analysis, wrested the initiative from the enemy, changing the course of the war in its favor. After the Stalingrad operation, all levels of command, including the Supreme Command, attained a high degree of efficiency. Most commanders of fronts and armies acquitted themselves well. Upon losing the initiative, the Nazi command failed to cope with the difficulties of organizing operations and executing them, which brought their downfall considerably closer. Indeed, it marked the beginning of the general rout of Nazi Germany. During the war, the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party and the Soviet government devoted much attention to the armed forces. More than 200 sittings of the Politburo, Organizational Bureau, and Secretariat of the party's Central Committee discussed various foreign policy, economic, and strategic decisions. These were implemented through the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet, the Council of People's Commissars, and the State Defense Committee, or the Stavka of the Supreme Command. The Supreme Command followed Lenin's principles of centralized troop control. It supervised all military operations on land, sea, and in the air, and built up the strategic effort by calling in reserves and the partisan movement. The General Staff, as I have mentioned, was one of its executive arms. The new forms and methods of warfare naturally required a reorganization of troop control. As a result, the General Staff was relieved of several functions, which were turned over to other administrations. The General Staff encompassed all the arms and services, land forces, navy, air force, and so on. It dealt chiefly with tactical and strategic issues, studied the situation, and analyzed and organizationally supported the decisions of the Stavka of the Supreme Command. Following its reorganization, the General Staff gained in efficiency, becoming an executive body that performed its functions with significantly better results until the end of the war. Certainly, faults did occur after the reorganization as well, but only in a few of the more intricate cases. To improve control of the fronts, the State Defense Committee formed 3 High Commands of Directions on July 10, 1941. 1. The Northwestern Direction. Commander-in-Chief, Marshal K. Yer Voroshilov. Member of Military Council, A. Zhdanov. Chief of Staff, General M. V. Zakharov. 2. The Western Direction. Commander-in-Chief, Marshal S. K. Timoshenko. Member of Military Council, N.A. Bulganin. Chief of Staff, General G. K. Malandin. 3. The Southwestern Direction. Commander-in-Chief, Marshal S. M. Budeny. Member of Military Council, N.S. Khrushchev, from August 5, 1941. Chief of Staff, A.P. Pokrovsky. When forming these high commands, the State Defense Committee expected that they would help the Supreme Command improve troop control and coordinate the operations of fronts, the Air Force, and the Navy. It was assumed that the military councils of these high commands would use local manpower and resources more effectively than the front commands. However, the first few months showed that the high commands did not meet expectations. The Supreme Command continued to exercise direct guidance over the fronts. The high commands of directions had neither reserve troops nor material resources at their disposal to influence operations. They could not enforce any fundamental decision without the consent of the Supreme Command, reducing them to intermediary roles. Consequently, in 1942, they were abolished. Once again, the Supreme Command supervised operations across numerous fronts deployed over a vast area. This caused considerable difficulties, particularly in coordinating the efforts of several fronts operating side by side. A search began for new methods of control, which ultimately led to an effective form of strategic leadership. A unique institution for influencing and supervising the activity of fronts was established. The Supreme Command appointed its representatives to key sectors. Precedents dating back to World War I existed when representatives of the Supreme Command were sent directly to the site of operations, exerting significant influence on developments. In the early months of the Great Patriotic War, several Soviet generals were also dispatched to the field and used the powers vested in them to work towards a more favorable outcome. Now, after a year of fighting, the activity of Supreme Command representatives in certain sectors acquired greater purpose. From that point forward, Supreme Command representatives were sent only to those fronts, or groups of fronts, where a critical task affecting the course of a crucial operation or campaign was being carried out at that moment. The Supreme Command selected its representatives from among the most capable generals, expecting them to know the situation in detail and, as a rule, to have participated in planning the operation in question. The Supreme Command expected its representatives to guide the operation and bear full responsibility for it, vesting them with all prerogatives of power. To illustrate this point, I will cite a telegram from Stalin to the Supreme Command representative on the Crimean Front, L.Z. Mekhlis, in May 1942. Sensing an attempt by Mekhlis to evade responsibility for the grave Soviet setbacks on the Kerch Peninsula, Stalin wrote to him, "You have adopted the strange position of an outside observer who is not responsible for the Crimean Front. It is a very convenient position, but rotten through and through. On the Crimean Front, you are no outside observer, but a responsible representative of the Supreme Command, who is accountable for all the successes and failures of the front, and is obliged to rectify the mistakes of the command. You and the command are jointly responsible for the left flank of the front having proved so abjectly weak. If the situation showed that the enemy would begin advancing in the morning, and you took no measures to organize resistance, confining yourself to passive criticism, the worse for you. It means that you have not yet understood that you were sent to the Crimean Front not as a state controller, but as a responsible representative of the Supreme Command. This clearly worded document leaves no doubt as to the duties of the representative of the Supreme Command. As the scale of Soviet offensive operations increased, the duties of the Supreme Command representatives continued to evolve. During the summer campaign of 1944, for example, Plan Bagration was being implemented in the Western strategic direction. Under this plan, drawn up collectively by the Supreme Command, the General Staff, and the military councils of the respective fronts, 4 Soviet fronts, along with long-range aviation and the partisans, struck the enemy simultaneously. Their mission was to crush Army Group Center, the main concentration of Nazi troops. At that time, the situation required us to extend the powers of the Supreme Command representatives. In this operation, they were granted the right to direct the operations of the fronts. I was assigned to the 1st and 2nd Byelorussian fronts and the 1st Ukrainian front. Alexander Vasilevsky, with whom I was to cooperate, supervised the offensive of the 1st and 2nd Baltic fronts and the 3rd Byelorussian front. I firmly believe that due to the broad initiative granted by the Supreme Command to its representatives, troop control became more mobile, prompt, and flexible. The mission of the troops was carried out with notable success. The Red Army liberated Soviet Byelorussia, a large section of the Lithuanian and Latvian Soviet Socialist republics, the western part of Ukraine, and the southeastern part of Poland. Whom did the Supreme Command send as its main representatives to the active army? Initially, it sent its own members, including Voroshilov, Zhukov, and Timoshenko. Chief of General Staff Vasilevsky was also continuously dispatched to the field as a Supreme Command representative. In addition to the main representatives, Generals Voronov, Antonov, Shtemenko, Meklis, and others were also frequently selected for the job. Apart from the plenipotentiary representative who executed Supreme Command decisions directly on site, there were also specially authorized representatives. They were sent to assist the commands and the main Supreme Command representatives in coordinating the use of various arms and services. I served as a Supreme Command representative at least 15 times during the war. Alexander Vasilevsky was also sent to the fronts as often as I was. Time and again we set out for the front lines together, working jointly on significant operations such as the Stalingrad Battle, the Battle of the Kursk Bulge, the offensive in Ukraine across the Dnieper, and the liberation of Byelorussia. Everyone who has worked with Vasilevsky notes his profound knowledge and clear thinking. He did not tolerate slipshod work or hit-and-run estimates. He required all his subordinates involved in an operation to use precise data and base their forecasts on accurate facts. I always recall our fruitful collaboration in organizing and implementing operations with deep gratification. Supreme Command representatives did not command any fronts. That function remained with the commanders. However, they had great authority and could influence the course of battles, rectify mistakes committed by the front or army commands, and assist them effectively in obtaining material or technical supplies. I do not recall a single occasion when the recommendations of a Supreme Command representative were not carried out. Certainly not all representatives had equal abilities and powers. Many lacked the powers that Vasilevsky and I had. For one thing, they did not associate directly with the Supreme Commander, and they lacked the requisite staff and means of communication. This compelled them to use the personnel and communication means of the respective front or army, which were already overburdened. The Supreme Commander required daily reports from Supreme Command representatives on the preparation or conduct of operations. Especially important situation reports and proposals for new operations were, by Stalin's orders, written by hand in one copy and delivered to him through his aide, Anne Poskribyshev. If, for some reason, no reports arrived from a Supreme Command representative, the Supreme Commander would personally phone and inquire, "What's up? Don't you have anything to report today?" I remember one occasion when, at the end of September 1942, Stalin summoned G.M. Malenkov and myself to GHQ from the Stalingrad area. After hearing my situation report, Stalin turned to Malenkov. "And why, Comrade Malenkov, have you sent us no information about things at Stalingrad for all of 3 weeks?" "Comrade Stalin, I signed the reports that were sent to you by Zhukov every day," Malenkov retorted. "We did not send you there as Zhukov's commissar, but as a member of the State Defense Committee, and you should have kept us informed." The institution of Supreme Command representatives survived nearly until the end of the war. It was not until the final campaign that it became redundant. This alone is persuasive evidence that such a unit of strategic guidance was exceedingly useful and necessary. The need for Supreme Command representatives did not diminish until the strategic front shrank to less than half of its original size, and the number of fronts decreased. By that time, front commanders had developed into eminent generals, and their staffs had acquired experience in organizing and controlling major operations. That is why the operations of the final 1945 campaign were prepared and carried out without Supreme Command representatives. In these operations, the East Prussian, Vistula Oder, and a few others, guidance of fronts was exercised directly by the Supreme Command from Moscow. This also applied to the final battle of the war, the Berlin operation, when control of the fronts was assumed personally by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Marshal S.K. Timoshenko was the only Supreme Command representative who stayed on with the 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts until the end of the war in Europe. The Supreme Command was a collective body. Its work was based on a sensible blend of collectivism and one-man leadership. In all cases, the final say belonged to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. The spadework in planning strategic operations and campaigns was done by the General Staff, the executive branch of the Supreme Command, Stavka, with a few members of the latter participating. This was preceded by considerable planning within the framework of the Politburo and the State Defense Committee, which discussed the international situation of the moment and studied the political and military potentials of the belligerent countries. Not until after a study and discussion of all general aspects would they make forecasts of a political or military nature. As a result of all this intricate work, there emerged the political and military strategy adopted by the Supreme Command. When working on a new operation, Stalin would usually summon the Chief of General Staff and his deputy to jointly examine the tactical and strategic situation along the entire Soviet-German front, the state of the troops of various fronts, the intelligence delivered by various reconnaissance agencies, and the availability of reserves for all arms of the service. Thereupon, the Supreme Command summoned the Chief of Red Army Logistics, the commanders of the various arms of the service, and the chiefs of the main divisions of the Defense Commissariat who were to back up the contemplated operation. Then, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, his deputy, and the Chief of General Staff would discuss the tactical and strategic capability of our troops. The Chief of General Staff and the Deputy Supreme Commander would examine and estimate our potential for the operation or operations in question. Usually, the Supreme Commander gave them 4 or 5 days for the job. Then, a tentative decision was taken, and the Supreme Commander ordered the Chief of General Staff to obtain the opinion of the front military councils about the planned operation. While the command and staff of the front reflected upon it, the General Staff would work on the details of the operation and coordinate the actions of the several fronts involved. Assignments would be drawn up for the intelligence and reconnaissance services, for the long-range aviation, for the partisan forces behind the enemy lines, and for the transport and communication agencies responsible for the movement of replenishments, Supreme Command reserves and supplies. Finally, a day would be named for the front commanders to come to General Headquarters and present their operational plan. Usually the Supreme Commander received them in the presence of his deputy, the Chief of General Staff, and a few members of the State Defense Committee. After a painstaking examination, Stalin approved the operational plans and the timetable, indicating what he wanted to be attended to more closely. The Supreme Command representative was then named to coordinate the operation of the several fronts, as well as those responsible for logistics and supplies, and the timely regrouping of the troops and Supreme Command reserves. The activity of the Supreme Command was not confined to just planning and preparing operations and campaigns. The volume of work and the attendant difficulties depended largely on where, when, against whom, and by what armies and means the operation was to be carried out. The decisions of the Supreme Command were forwarded to those who were to execute them in the form of directives signed by the Supreme Commander and the Chief of General Staff. Sometimes directives were signed by Stalin and his deputy. From 1943 on, Supreme Command directives were signed by Stalin and Antonov, as the Deputy Supreme Commander and the Chief of General Staff were often with the troops in the field. When less important operations were drawn up, front commanders were not usually summoned to General Headquarters and submitted their opinions in writing. The overall planning of material and technical supplies was, as a rule, done by the General Staff in cooperation with A.V. Krylev, Red Army Chief of Logistics, N.D. Yakovlev, Chief of the Central Artillery Division, and other Chiefs of Defense Commissariat divisions. When ready, the supply plans were submitted for approval to the Supreme Command or the State Defense Committee. The fronts that were to carry out an operation would receive instructions concerning material and technical supplies simultaneously with the operational directive. As mentioned earlier, the Supreme Command GHQ and the General Staff were located in Moscow throughout the war. When Nazi troops came close to the capital, the General Staff was divided into 2 sections. One section, headed by A.M. Vasilevsky, First Deputy Chief of General Staff, remained in Moscow with the Supreme Command, while the other section, headed by B.M. Shaposhnikov, was temporarily transferred to an alternative command post. Soon, however, it returned to Moscow. During the war, Stalin held 5 official posts: Supreme Commander-in-Chief, General Secretary of the party's Central Committee, Chairman of the USSR Council of People's Commissars, Chairman of the State Defense Committee, and People's Commissar for Defense. He worked on a tight schedule, 15 to 16 hours a day. He set great store by the work of the General Staff and trusted it implicitly. As a rule, he never adopted important decisions without first looking into the General Staff's analytic situation report and its proposals. The situation report usually opened with intelligence concerning the enemy. The war had shown that much depended on the command's ability to reconnoitre the enemy, process the obtained intelligence swiftly, and draw the correct conclusions. Throughout the war, save for a few cases in its initial period, the Supreme Command had given the various intelligence agencies the right bearings. They performed their jobs promptly and with a high degree of efficiency, learning to analyse the situation with great accuracy. The Supreme Command was well informed of the situation at the fronts and reacted swiftly to any changes. It closely followed the course of the operations through the General Staff, introduced requisite corrections, finalised troop actions, and set new objectives if the developments called for it. When necessary, it saw to the timely regrouping of troops and resources to secure the goals of the operations, and in special cases called off operations. The Supreme Commander established a rigid routine. Twice a day, the General Staff showed him a situation map, pointing out all changes that had occurred in the interim. A brief note from the Chief of General Staff was attached. A special corps of General Staff officers constituted an important unit. Together with ranking officers of the Operations Division, they did a tremendous amount of work directly in the field, including areas where fighting was underway. The corps was large enough for the General Staff to have its representatives permanently with all front, army, corps and divisional staffs. The selfless and useful labours of these General Staff officers have not yet been duly treated in our war and history books. They were brave, knowledgeable officers, many of whom laid down their lives in battle. All modest men, they deserve our deep gratitude and affectionate remembrance. The General Staff officers working in the field and the Operations Division officers attached to the General Staff were commendable and tireless helpers of the Supreme Command. I have already stated that the Supreme Command and the General Staff ensured that military campaigns and strategic operations were thoroughly and properly planned well in advance. Now I take the liberty to express my opinion about the plans and decisions of our Supreme Command. All planning is futile if it does not rest on a scientific forecast of the possible course of the operation, the forms and methods whereby the troops are to attain its objective. The Supreme Command saw farther ahead and more clearly than the Nazi strategic leadership. To begin with, it had the advantage of knowing the general laws of struggle resting on the dependable foundation of Marxism-Leninism. Second, it had a better understanding of the concrete situation that determined the course of events at the fronts. That is why, as a rule, our Supreme Command was able to anticipate what the Nazi command was likely to do and took the requisite steps to thwart its intentions. Cumulatively, all this ensured the high efficiency of our military planning. To be sure, the Supreme Command GHQ could not confine its activity to just the main operations of the armed forces. The war required a firm hand, that of the Supreme Command, all along the strategic front, on land, at sea, and in the air. The forces committed to the main operations needed the support of troops in the less important sectors. To back up the counteroffensive operation at Stalingrad, for example, a number of offensive operations were planned and carried out on other fronts as well. Their purpose was to pin down or destroy troops and weaponry that the Nazi command might have rushed to the sector of the crucial operation, where the enemy was suffering setback after setback and desperately needed reinforcements. This occurred in the south of the country, and on the Western and Kalinin fronts in late 1942 and early 1943, and also when breaking the blockade of Leningrad in January 1943. Usually the secondary operations did not follow any advance plan and were carried out on the orders of the Supreme Command to suit the general situation. They were drafted in a limited time and on a relatively small scale. Yet, together with the basic operation and by the overall results, they comprise the content of any military campaign. Planning and preparing operations is a most difficult endeavour, with many different aspects requiring not only enough time, but also considerable creative and organisational effort on the part of a large group of people, primarily the Supreme Command, the General Staff, and the commands of various fronts. The burden of responsibility to the nation borne by those who did the work was truly enormous. The plan for the Battle of the Kursk Bulge and its development, for example, took 3 months to complete in the spring of 1943. All the campaigns that followed were planned 2 or 3 months before the jump-off. When working on a campaign, without revealing its essence, the Supreme Command acquainted front commanders with the specific tasks they were to accomplish in its context. Front commanders worked out and submitted their ideas concerning the plan of the front's operations to the General Staff. The General Staff examined, analysed, adjusted, and reported these, together with the front command, to the Supreme Command. In many cases, when working on the course of the fighting in the planned operations, the Supreme Command tackled fundamental tactical issues as well as the strategic, such as the order of battle and the methods of using artillery, mortars, tanks, etc. On a few occasions, it had even addressed concrete situation-related tactical questions when they directly concerned the fighting at key points of fronts, armies, corps, and divisions, as was the case during the defence of Stalingrad and the Stalingrad counteroffensive. Advance planning relied on complete and timely intelligence, which gave the Supreme Command a precise idea of the intentions and state of the enemy. An accurate estimate of the general military situation and of our own strength and resources was no less important. The active army and the reserves of manpower and material supplies always ranked first in the estimates of the top military leadership. Besides, the Soviet Union was part of a coalition and was therefore obliged to take account of the intents and actions of its allies. The Soviet military leadership's profoundly scientific prevision of developments substantially contributed to the correct planning of campaigns and strategic operations. It enabled the Supreme Command to determine the manpower and resources necessary to subdue the enemy and create favourable conditions for subsequent actions. The events of 1943 illustrate how well prepared the operations of the Soviet armed forces were. The brilliant culmination of the Battle of Stalingrad and the expulsion of enemy troops from the northern Caucasus were followed by successful operations at Ostrogozhsk and Voronezh, with our troops emerging in the Kursk Bulge. This allowed us to straighten out the front in the Moscow sector, which was crucial at the time. By crushing the Nazi shock force in the Battle of the Kursk Bulge, on which the Nazi High Command had pinned great hopes, we created a highly favourable situation for ourselves along the Soviet-German front for all subsequent operations in the summer and autumn of 1943. In all these operations, the Nazis suffered irreplaceable losses in men, materiel, and weaponry. More importantly, the morale of the German troops fell to an unprecedented low. Despite the absence of a second front in Europe, the Soviet Union brought Nazi Germany to the brink of military disaster. To bring about this disaster, we needed to organize and carry out a few more crushing offensives, which the Supreme Command accomplished brilliantly. The battles won by the Soviet troops significantly impacted the situation on other World War II fronts. Thanks to the victories of the Soviet army, our allies in the anti-Hitler coalition could carry out successful operations at that time in Sicily and southern Italy. The Wehrmacht's defeats in the summer and autumn of 1943 destroyed the confidence that Nazi Germany's satellites had in the Hitler regime. The fascist bloc began to fall apart. A more favourable strategic situation developed for the Soviet armed forces, which the Supreme Command skillfully exploited while preparing the 1944 operations. No longer did Nazi Germany's allies and the neutral countries believe that Hitler's regime could escape total defeat. Most importantly, the elements in Germany that had brought Hitler to power and had supported him lost trust in the Nazi leadership. Many Germans began to realize they had been dangerously deluded by the easy victories of the early war years, and that Germany could not withstand the Soviet armed forces and the anti-Hitler coalition. Upon returning from the Tehran conference, Supreme Commander Stalin said, "Roosevelt has given me his firm word to open extensive actions in France in 1944. I think he will keep his word." As he always did when in high spirits, Stalin filled his pipe unhurriedly with tobacco from Herzegovina floor cigarettes, smacking his lips as he pulled on it after lighting, exhaling a few billows of smoke, and walking slowly to and fro along the carpet in his office. "And if he doesn't keep his word," he thought aloud, "we are strong enough to crush Hitler's Germany on our own."